You're listening to episode 94 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Professor Susan Blackmore joins us to speak about meditation, consciousness, and her move from belief in the paranormal to skepticism. It's fairly well known that I'm a skeptic, not to be confused with a cynic or a denier. As host of the Skeptic's Guide to the Universe podcast, Dr. Stephen Novella of the New England Skeptical Society has described, "A skeptic is one who prefers beliefs and conclusions that are reliable and valid to ones that are comforting or convenient, and therefore rigorously and openly applies the methods of science and reason to all empirical claims, especially their own. A skeptic provisionally proportions acceptance of any claim to valid logic and a fair and thorough assessment of available evidence, and studies the pitfalls of human reason and the mechanisms of deception so as to avoid being deceived by others or themselves. Our experiences in meditation and in other states of consciousness are worth studying. Beneficial, observable effects occur, but we sometimes get tripped up in the conclusions we draw about them and the causes we think explain them. Skepticism provides us with a way to access what we think may be happening and learn. What we find may not be comforting or convenient, or even close to what we thought was happening, but our practice is about seeing things as they really are, not how we want them to be. With the cleansing of delusion, we have an opportunity to learn and grow on a stable foundation of knowledge. My guest today is uniquely skilled and suited to this podcast, as I rarely get to speak with someone who is well known to both skeptics and meditators alike. Sue Blackmore is a freelance writer, lecturer, and broadcaster, and a visiting professor at the University of Plymouth. She has a degree in psychology and physiology from Oxford University, an MSc and a PhD in parapsychology, yes, parapsychology, from the University of Surrey. Her research interests include memes, evolutionary theory, consciousness, and meditation. She practices Zen and campaigns for drug legalization. Sue Blackmore no longer works on the paranormal. She writes for several magazines and newspapers, blogs for The Guardian newspaper and Psychology Today, and is a frequent contributor and presenter on radio and television. She is the author of over 60 academic articles, about 50 book contributions, and many book reviews. Her books include Dying to Live, In Search of the Light, Test Your Psychic Powers, The Meme Machine, Conversations on Consciousness, Zen and the Art of Consciousness, and Consciousness, an Introduction. Her work has been translated into more than 20 other languages. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice Sumatra black tea. And our guest today is Professor Susan Blackmore. Sue, thank you so much for being here.
It's a pleasure. Hello.
I was very glad to get this interview, and I wanted to thank Dana Nuri for helping arrange this. And I was at a Minnesota Skeptics get-together last night, and I mentioned that I was interviewing someone who had actually studied parapsychology and had become a skeptic, and 3 different people said your name. It was great excitation. You were very well known to this crowd, and someone said, "She's my hero. You got Sue Blackmore. That's great." So,
I feel a mixture of embarrassment and pleasure at that.
It should be great joy. This is a good crowd. So, again, I do appreciate you spending time with me. You've written many books, in particular in the areas of consciousness, and prior to that, you have also written some books on paranormal abilities. What I'd like you to do, Sue, if you would, is tell us about your background and your work with parapsychology and maybe a transition that has occurred since that time.
Well, it's very difficult for me to know where the beginning was. I can remember age about 16 or 17 reading a book by Rene Haynes called The Sixth Sense and thinking, ooh, how exciting, you know. But it was never a big deal to me. When I went up to Oxford in 1970, that's more than 40 years ago, to read physiology and psychology, I joined all kinds of societies. And I don't really know what my motivation was. I joined the students' Oxford University Society for Psychical Research. And that nothing else might have happened except for the fact that I didn't hear anything for a couple of weeks. And then one morning, this gorgeous second year with long hair and a hippie sort of type guy turned up and said that he was the only remaining man from the previous year of that society, and would I like to start it up with him again? And I took one look at him and thought, yes. And so I became the secretary and then the president of the OU Psychical Research Society. And it was great fun. We had mediums and psychics, and, we learned to read tarot cards and gaze into crystal balls and all of those kinds of things. But, I belonged to other societies. I was going to lectures and writing my essays, and, it was just part of that until... it was towards the end of my first term there. One night, we were having a Ouija board session, which I must say I wouldn't recommend to people. I mean, for psychological, not psychic, paranormal reasons, I think it's a pretty dodgy thing to do. But we did it a lot in those days. We sat around with our fingers on the glass, and, it spelt out words, and we asked questions and what have you. And it's also quite exhausting. And I was in any case, I was exhausted because I was getting up for 9 o'clock lectures and then staying up half the night playing Monopoly or whatever things we used to do in those days. And after this session, we went back to a friend's room, put on some music, I don't know, Grateful Dead or Pink Floyd or some, that sort of music.
Great music like that, yeah.
Great music. I sat on the floor cross-legged, smoked a joint, which was, we did. This was 1970, this was the norm for us then. So it wasn't as though that was a particularly unusual thing, but it was late at night and I was tired, and the idea was just to go and relax for a little while before, going to bed. And I found myself going down a dark tunnel towards a bright light in this music. And it was a tunnel of leaves, which I drew a painting of afterwards. It was like being like the sound of horses and a cat zooming down, great roaring noise and kind of rushing down this as though through an autumnal road with leaves all round, And then someone said, "Where are you, Sue?" And it must have looked a bit weird, mustn't I, for them to say, "Where are you, Sue?" But that question precipitated a complete rethink. Well, where am I? I'm in Vicky's room. I'm going down this tunnel. And then it was as though everything kind of switched and clarified. And as bright as daylight, more bright than daylight, I was looking down from the ceiling on the 3 of us in the room. Vicky, whose room it was, and my friend Kevin, the one I already mentioned. And I was like, oh, I'm on the ceiling, and had this bizarre experience of watching the mouth of the body down there open and shut, saying the words I was speaking. And this perhaps doesn't seem as odd now when we have kind of mobile phones and you can sort of speak at a distance, but it was a really bizarre feeling that thing down there was doing the speaking for me. And I think I subsequently learned that out-of-body experiences are very common, but usually very short. They just, happen and then they're over. And I think Mine would have been like that, were it not for the fact that Kevin then said, "Oh, it's astral projection. Oh, can you do this? Can you do that? What about this? What about?" and just kept on asking me questions.
Yeah.
And so I kept on answering. And I've written about this in various places. There is online a complete account that I wrote 3 days later. If people are interested, they can see that, because, of course, 40 years later, can I tell the truth? Can I remember? To me, all this time later, it's as vivid a memory as anything. It was such an extraordinary experience, and it lasted for more than 2 hours. But still, if I were you, I wouldn't believe that my memory were accurate. So it's substantiated in some details, at least by what I wrote a few days later. But in essence, what happened was it went from classic astral projection, which I had heard about through my psychic studies in this society, in which there was an astral, astral cord, a separate body that traveled around and so on. I was able to travel all over the place. Then it began to change into a very much less kind of substantial and ordered experience, more kind of weird. And then I tried to get back, and that was extremely difficult, and I couldn't do it. And I overshot and went inside my body, as it were, how it seemed to me at the time, and became absolutely tiny, and then got frightened and thought, no, I've got to be the same size as the body, and tried to get bigger. And that led, oddly enough, to what I subsequently learned to be a classic mystical experience of dissolution of self, oneness with the universe. I mean, I just got bigger and bigger and just became everything. And that complete disintegration of self, or loss of self, or self and other becoming the same, I suppose, was absolutely unheard of to me. It didn't mean anything to me other than it was happening, and it was so real and so vivid and so extraordinary. And subsequent to that, the long hard road home. And it was the experience I had then towards the end of this was very much like I subsequently discovered when the whole term near-death experience was invented and so on, was to be like the decision to return, where people who come close to death feel there's some kind of barrier or something, and they can go on to die, or they can choose to return. I don't think it's a real choice. I think the choice is made by the physiological state. But anyway, that's how it feels. And to me, it was like that. It was kind of, you can stay in this bliss and oneness and not being you, and whatever. Or you've got to make that struggle to become somebody again. And I can remember now saying to myself things along the lines of, if you want to go anywhere, you've got to take the body with you. You've got to get behind the eyes and look out. When you have been, everything's been omnipresent. The idea that you've got to be behind some eyes looking out through them is kind of really weird. So I went through all of that, and then I was utterly exhausted for a couple of days. I mean, a bizarre experience. Anyway, to answer your question, that experience then, I didn't know what to make of it. Obviously, absolutely nothing in the physiology and psychology I was learning at the time was going to help me with this. And the only connections I had were with the paranormal aspects of it. Thinking that my soul must have left my body, or my astral body must have left the physical, or whatever. And therefore, I immediately, straight away after this experience, got this great determination that I was going to prove to the world that there are souls and spirits and life after death and telepathy and clairvoyance and psychokinesis and every number of things that all seemed to me to have been shown to me in this experience. That, looking back, was a ridiculous conclusion, but I can perfectly understand why, at the age of 19 or whatever, with what I knew and didn't know, that wasn't so crazy to jump to that conclusion, and that was why I decided I want to become a parapsychologist, which I did.
And you did, and you've written books on the topic. And so tell us more about then your practicing. You've got your PhD in parapsychology.
Mm.
What was a transition point for you? What started to make you go, maybe not always so?
Oh, that was very early. Maybe not always so, probably the day after the out-of-body experience. Because I had deliberately gone looking at things like the gutters and the roofs of the building I was in and other buildings around Oxford to see that, if I could see them, and then the next day that would prove that I really had gone there. And they were wrong. I'd seen these kind of old-fashioned iron gutters, and actually they were modern plastic ones, and the chimneys weren't where I saw them. But, never mind, things are a bit different on the astral plane. It's fine, don't worry about it, But I'm intrinsically a skeptical person in the sort of small s kind of skepticism, asking questions, not being satisfied, always saying, why, mummy, why? And I was like that. So I would say there was never a point when I wasn't able to doubt things, but the experience had been so powerful that it drove me on for a long time. So what I did was I got a place to do a PhD. Your American listeners should know that the British PhD system is very different from the US one, and was even more different then. So in order to do a PhD then in England, I had to fund myself. No one was going to fund me. That was very rare at those times. Most students then would have been funded, but I got a part-time job and funded myself. But the important thing is, as long as you can find a university to take you and a supervisor who will supervise you, your job over the 3 years of the PhD, or however long it takes, is to do original research and to write it up in a thesis. You don't have to go to classes, or you don't. There's no taught component. There wasn't then any taught component at all. So I did manage to find myself a professor who knew absolutely nothing about parapsychology, but was prepared to take me on. He used to sidle up to me in the interviews and sort of stroke my leg, and there was those days. But never mind, I had a supervisor, and actually he was pretty good at experimental design and statistics, which is probably what I needed. Okay. So I spent 3 years designing experiments and carrying them out. And I was lucky that in my university, this was the University of Surrey, in the south of England, that they had optional courses, and I offered to teach a course in parapsychology, and immediately got 120 students, which was like unheard of. You can imagine students wanting to do it. And I used those as subjects in my experiments. I saw them every week, and we'd have a lecture, and then we'd do a little experiment. And I was able, therefore, to do lots and lots and lots of experiments. And the first two, these were telepathy experiments, got sort of significant results. I was like, oh, yeah, we're really getting somewhere. And then I discovered a mistake in my statistics and put it right. And, by the time I'd done half a dozen experiments, I'd got the statistics. I'd learned a lot more. I'd got my experimental designs better, and I wasn't getting any results. And I kept on at this for a while. And, then you asked, well, when did I start to doubt? Well, I kept doubting then. Well, maybe this doesn't work. But of course, other things do, but maybe this doesn't. And then people said to me, well, your subjects aren't relaxed enough. So I got a group and trained them in relaxation. And, they're not good enough at imagery. So we had an imagery evening class, and we did imagery. And some meditation techniques as well. And then I said, well, you need twins, or you need children, or you need to use the Ganzfeld. And it went on and on and on. Always another corner you could turn around. But it accumulated and accumulated. And I would say for the first couple of years of my PhD, I didn't really have much doubt that even if this thing didn't work, well, there was something else that would work. But once I got to the point of saying, well, I know tarot cards work because I can read them myself, and doing double-blind experiments, pretty well conducted, I think, that showed that it's all face-to-face, body language and psychological stuff going on, that the cards are kind of irrelevant. And, these things, they were more stabs to the heart in a way. And then going back to out-of-body experiences, and neuroscience had sort of started up then, really, and was becoming, we began to learn more. And those were the things, they were the last things that I was really sure there was some paranormal component. I don't know where I got to in that story of disillusionment through research, when there's a particular one of those flashbulb memories, which of course may not be true, but this is how it is. This is how it seems in my memory to be, of me lying in the bath in my little house in Guildford. And as I very commonly did, lying there of an evening thinking through, well, if I did this experiment and if I tried that. And on this one particular occasion, thinking, what if it's all rubbish? What if there's nothing? And I can remember the shock with which I even contemplated that thought, because it was a new thought. What if all of it's rubbish? And that was, I think, a kind of turning point, because up till then it had been, I'm skeptical, I'm doubtful, I'm doubting, I'm doing all the scientific attitude, but I know really. To being, hang on a minute, maybe I'm wrong. I'm wrong so deeply, deep down wrong, completely wrong. Everything I've based my life on, everything I've based on, ooh, I'm Sue Blackmore, I'm different from everybody else, I believe in all these paranormal things, ooh, I'm going to show them. Oh, I'm wearing all this hippie gear and this all goes along, and I read my room is full of crystal balls and tarot cards, and that was my identity. It was all that stuff. So you can see it was kind of really frightening to contemplate the possibility that all of it was rubbish. But I did, and I carried on for quite a bit after that turning point, and really sort of checking things out, trying the last things. But the fire went out of my belief at some point then. And by the time I wrote up my PhD, which had many experiments, all of which on average came out to 1 in 20 significant at the 1 in 20 level, I was pretty much changed around by then. And that was 1979, 1980 when I completed it.
It's interesting that you, in your story, you talk about there was this really quite compelling experience you had that seemed very, very real. And people do describe this in meditation or on psychoactive drugs or whatever is the causative agent. And you, however, maintained a investigative attitude, and you checked it out, and you did experiments, and you happily, as you said, had an advisor who had some experience with this, and you crafted experiments to check it out and found the errors and looked in it. And I think about all of the people who, in meditation, they start recounting past lives, or they have an out-of-body experience, and their only previous social understanding of this kind of thing is that, oh, well, they've confirmed this in hospitals, and there was that famous thing with the sneaker where someone went out of their body, they saw a sneaker on a ledge, and that's not what factually occurred. That is incorrect. That's not the complete story. And without having an analytical mind, without really having the interest in investigating it, there's just acceptance of that as a factual representation of what's going on. And so it's very then challenging to even introduce the concept of, well, hang on, there can be a natural explanation for this. It doesn't have to be something supernatural. Do you get into those conversations every now and then? And
Not so much now, but I've spent most of my life in such conversations, yes. One way of responding to that is, on a simplistic level at least, is it's very, very important not to doubt people's experiences if you're going to do research on these things, and to listen to what they say. What you should be doubting is their interpretation of their experience, when people will have an out-of-the-body experience and then say, oh, this proves my soul left my body, or the Bardo realms, or whatever they think it proves, or Jesus loves me, or whatever it might be, which is precisely what I did first time round. I jumped to all those conclusions within, as you said, the knowledge that I had at the time. I said that helps when you do that, because I get very, very upset with the kind of skeptics who say, are out-of-body experiences real or not? Do they happen or not? Well, are they real? Do you mean does something leave the body, or do you mean do people have the experience? They have them. We know they have them. We've done the surveys. They happen all over the world. We know people have mystical experiences. Let's take these things seriously. What's in question is the interpretation. But I said this was kind of simplistic because actually you can't entirely separate out people's experience, their memories of their experience, from their interpretation, because even during those experiences they're interpreting them. So if you're trained in a particular mystical tradition or meditation tradition or religion or something, even during the experience you will be using those interpretations, and it's very hard to extricate them. So scientifically it's a hard job, but at the simple level we can say let's take people's experiences seriously. And I've had a lot of experience of people coming to me with weird experiences, and I hope that I have been able to help them to think with a more open mind about what happened to them. Give them the confidence, first, that weird experiences happen to people all the time, all over the place, and a lot of people won't talk about it because they feel it's weird. That's step number one. Don't think there's something wrong with you because you're having out-of-body experiences or sleep paralysis or whatever it might be. Step number two is how did you interpret it, and why where do you think that interpretation was coming from? Can you think of any other possibilities? And in that way kind of open people up to thinking. Very few people will go on, as I did, to be scientists who investigate those things as their life's work, but actually a lot can, natural curiosity in people's minds is often enough for them to go and read other things than they might have read, talk to people in a different way, open up their minds to a possibility that does not close down on some religious interpretation or some ridiculous idea that simply is scientifically impossible, and then leads them off into, rejecting science and so on because of their experience.
Which we've seen a great deal when there's too firm a pushback and a dismissal of what was very meaningful to someone. Absolutely. Whether their interpretation is correct or not. Then you get people more entrenched in their views.
Absolutely right, and that's why that's exactly what I meant really about, being trusting the people's experiences, honoring people's experiences, listening to what they have to say, because a lot of these experiences were like mine, I'm still talking about it 41 years later. There are experiences of this kind that become so much, that they're so powerful at the time, they become part of who you are. And I get really irritated, and all my years of trying to kind of broker between the skeptics movement and the psychic believers societies and so on. This was the one thing I was most strongly trying to achieve, that people on both sides would agree to honor experiences as worth studying, regardless of what they're interpreting. Argue forever with the skeptics and believers. Go and do the experiments, find out, but what neither side should be doing is just belittling things and saying, well, it's only, or it's just, or it's nothing but, or whatever.
Yeah, and we see that a great deal in the panels this year at the amazing meeting at TAM. There, every now and then, will be a rather dismissive attitude, particularly with the placebo effect, where it's okay, correctly, factually, perhaps there's no active repair of tissue for disease and illness. Very true. Okay, there's no evidence for that, but there are for pain modulation and things that are experiential positive benefits. And we do see that in studies, and we can trace what's going on in the brain. So to just dismiss it as, oh, that's just placebo, or that's just one's experience, is maybe not so helpful.
Yes, that's a very good example you've raised there, the placebo effect, because I would say exactly the same. It's a placebo effect, not it's just a placebo effect. The placebo effect is one of these absolutely fascinating things, very little understood. I had a fascinating conversation recently with Nick Humphrey, which some people will know from his books on consciousness. And his theory about the placebo effect is an evolutionary-based theory, as one might expect from him, along the lines of all of the time, every animal has got to be making a decision about how much of its resources to put into fighting disease, keeping healthy, whatever it is, and how much of its resources to put into getting food, dealing with stress, getting mates, or all the other things that you have to do. And you shouldn't always be putting all your resources into maintenance, health maintenance, and recovery. And particularly if you're under extreme stress and have a lot of problems to deal with, you may fail to deal with those problems and die if you put all your energies, your biological energies, into repair and health and so on. In fact, you may be best as a biological decision to creep quietly into a corner and just kind of give up for a bit, or wait till times are better, and not go on fighting. And what the placebo effect may be is that if you're in that kind of state where some of your capacity to recover is being reserved for good biological reasons, along comes a doctor in a white coat or a pill or all of those things, or a needle from acupuncture or whatever it might be, and causes a change in that attribution of resources. I'm particularly interested in this myself because I had chronic fatigue and I was in bed for a year, and then thereafter gradually recovered, and I'm fine now. No, my own interpretation of what happened there was that I had been pushing myself too hard in every possible way, working too hard, bringing up my kids, trying to do my job at home, get the kids to school, traveling around the world to give lectures. I mean, ludicrous life. No wonder I collapsed. And I thought the best thing to do is just lie there and actually give the body the time to recover that it needs, and thereafter try and not be so silly again. Well, it's easier said than done, but the principle, I think, is there. Now, I don't know that that's the right theory of the placebo effect. It may be part of, but my point really is the placebo effect is fascinating, well worth research, like so many of these other things we're talking about, and therefore for somebody to say, oh, it's just the placebo effect, well, I'm afraid they're somewhat ignorant of what an extraordinary thing they might be referring to.
Mm-hmm. And I will admit, in the way we've been talking about how we evolve in our ideas about things, whether it's from a system of belief to more of a skeptical need to test things out kind of transition, as we've been talking about, or on my side, having been overly dismissive of things and now having an understanding of the greater context of what these are in. These are positive changes, and we can and should make them because they carry us forward as a society, as social creatures moving forward.
I'm very interested in you saying you were overly dismissive and you changed. What led you to change in that direction?
One of the changes, and this was in particular on the placebo effect, was evidence. It was one of the interviews that I was doing for the podcast with Dr. Kathy Kerr, and we had a conversation about somatosensory modulation kinds of things in her work. And during the interview, she appropriately called me on my just the placebo effect kind of statements and said, well, but bear in mind, and went into the science of what's happening with that, the putting it into the context of experience, and that there are benefits to that, even if it's not going to necessarily cure one's cancer or, reduce a count of viruses if one has a particular illness. There are still positive benefits because we live within our minds, and we need to not dismiss that.
Oh, interesting.
It was. And speaking of living within our minds, and within that context, I'd like to segue a bit into your work on consciousness. You've written several books on the topic, and I was just this morning watching a YouTube video of you, and it was a response to Alan Wallace and his views on that. And I many listeners of the podcast have read my article, which is a response to some criticism that Alan has had of Stephen Batchelor's work. So I have also been in a position to point out some logical fallacies in some things Alan has said. I was wondering if you would talk for a few minutes about what your experience in consciousness and your views on it, and some of the things you may run into from meditators on consciousness with a capital C, and consciousness as, interestingly enough, not an emergent property of brain. And that was one of the things that you talked about in that video. And that's typically how I hear skeptics think of consciousness as, oh, it's just an emergent property of brain.
Yes, let me deal with the emergent property thing first, because the whole concept of emergent properties is very muddy and tricky. It sounds easy when you talk about wetness as an emergent property of, H2 and O getting together and making water and so on. You can find examples where it seems clear, but what would it mean for consciousness to be an emergent property of? I don't even know what it's a property of. Is consciousness a property of a brain? Is it a property of a brain state? Is it a property of a certain group of neurons? Is it a property of a person? Is it a property of the whole body? Is it a property of a social group? I mean, as soon as you start to analyze what on earth you mean, it's really difficult. And that's why I won't just go along with saying, oh, that's the answer, because I don't know what kind of an answer it is. But that aside, let me go back to the real bulk of your question. I suppose you can see from where I'd gone with all the parapsychology that I changed around in my views. I had to reinvent who I was and what my life was about. I became more and more skeptical. I joined, I was on Psychop in its early days and all of that stuff. And then I became a rent-a-skeptic. That's what I call it. where, or the BBC or ITV or any of these, TV channels in those days, and would want, 100 people who've seen a ghost, and then BBC balance, they've got to have somebody to say that it's all in the mind or whatever it was. And I enjoyed that. I did it, and that's how I ever got into the media in the first place. I thoroughly enjoyed that for a while. And there came a point when I'd really had enough of it. And that point came several times, and it was really only about 10 years ago that I finally got out. But I tried several times. I just I can't stand this anymore, being sucked constantly back into this paranormal stuff, which I really don't think is going anywhere, and I don't want to spend the rest of my life doing it. But in the back of my mind, or in the front of my mind even, was always this experience. And that experience had led me in many other ways as well. I'd gone into all that scientific work, but I'd also tried out all kinds of other techniques. I'd trained as a witch and done spells and dressed up in strange robes and, so all kinds of things, and been to medium sittings and what have you. The only thing that stuck was Zazen. I had first learned to meditate, sort of, in the mid-70s, and then kind of not kept it up, as people typically happen.
We sometimes don't sit every day, yes.
Yes. Well, I eventually, in the mid-80s, established a daily sitting routine, and I've scarcely missed a day since then. But certainly, getting going in the first place it's very difficult. Where does the motivation come from? Anyway, I did that. That was sort of chugging on, and began to become more important to me. I took a lot of drugs, and I think those on the experiential side, the drugs and the meditation led me into amazing experiences, which began to touch on that first out of the body experience, which began to make more sense of it. I began to recognize things. I would get into a certain state. Yes, I recognize that. That feels right. That feels familiar. So all that was going on alongside, in my private life, if you like, alongside the science. And they seemed to be quite separate. It never occurred to me, other than, you have your day job and you have your separate things in a way. But I've never, ever been happy with that. That's probably why I wrote the autobiography in 1986. I kind of, this is a person doing this. This isn't just science. This is actually a person doing the science, a person going through having to change their mind 100% round the other way, I began to contemplate really the implications of these experiences, and realized at some point, this is probably now 20 years ago, that actually that experience was really about consciousness. It wasn't about the paranormal. What was important about it wasn't about the paranormal. It was, who am I? What is experience? Who's experiencing things? What is this world of appearances? Constantly here when I open my eyes and ears, this stuff. What is this stuff? What is it? Straight into problems of dualism. Is there me and it? Is there, physical stuff and mental stuff? All of that. And I thought, that's what it's all about. And the experience itself was one of transcending or escaping dualism, of becoming one, of experiencing the world not dual. And none of that was apparent to me before, but it became more so. So what happened then, I was, by sort of 1990-ish, I was training with John Crook, who has recently died. A wonderful Zen teacher. He was, some say, the founding father of socioecology. He used to study first primates and then humans and the effect of ecology, i.e. the physical environment where they live, on their social life and so on. And to do that, he was in Ladakh and parts of Tibet and other parts of India and out in the Far East as well, and trained with many different kinds of Buddhist teachers, and became a Zen master himself. And I trained with him. He's been my main teacher all my life. Now, he was, at that time, this is sort of 1989, I think, teaching a course called Socioecology at Bristol University, which was really about consciousness. He kind of turned this course, the third year, final year psychology degree course, turned it into a consciousness course, and he wanted to take early retirement and devote himself to Zen teaching. And so I took over this course and had therefore to learn a lot more about consciousness and start teaching it. And I taught it at Bristol University for a couple of years, and then got a job at the other university in Bristol, where I made that one of my main things, was teaching the consciousness course. And it was out of that my textbook came, partly from all my own learning and partly from what the students taught me through those years. So that was the way I became drawn into what I loved, which was studying and teaching all the problems of consciousness. And then in the year 2000, I gave up my job because, well, the British university system was in trouble and massively expanding, and so many students and not enough time and all kinds of. I really wanted to devote myself much, much more to my own study, and so I gave up my job and I carried on always doing freelance work and wrote the textbook. I sort of naively thought that if I gave myself 2 years, I could read everything there was on consciousness and solve the problem. Well, I read a hell of a lot, and it was nothing like everything. And all I came to in the end was more perplexity rather than less. But that was wonderful.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And the book, I think, has had a new edition this year, Consciousness and Introduction.
Yes, that's the book I'm talking about. The original came out in 2003, and I did a new edition a couple of years ago, which came out last year.
Yeah, and you've also, I think, is it this year that Zen and the Art of Consciousness came out?
Yeah, but it's a complete con. I mean, I don't know what you think or what your listeners will think about the title, but, I wrote that book. The idea of the book just came to me one day. I thought it sounded lovely, 10 Zen questions, because you can tell by now, talking to me, what a questioning kind of person I am. I'm always like, well, what, why? Tell me, right. I don't understand. Right, find out. And this is so much part of my Zen practice, and that's why I like Zen rather than, I'm sure that's why I ended up practicing Zen rather than any other kind of practice, because it's very simple and straightforward, and basically it says shut up, sit down, and ask
right.
the questions yourself, have a look for yourself,
Mm-hmm.
find out for yourself. That suits me fine. And I realized that it was an extraordinary coming together, really, which I think many Buddhists would object to, and that's fine. I'm not a Buddhist. I haven't signed up to one. Nothing I say should be taken as the words of that's what a Buddhist says, because I'm not. I'm speaking for myself from my own experience, with the great benefit of Buddhist practice, of Zen practice that I've been taught and done many, many retreats. And there's this wonderful coming together, really, of realizing that the questions that I was asking in my consciousness textbook, the questions I asked in my book, Conversations on Consciousness, that I asked of the experts whom I interviewed for that book. The questions like, what is a self? What is consciousness? Is there duality, or how could we understand a non-dual world when everything feels dual? Is there free will? What's the point of it all? Who is acting, if anybody's acting? What happens after we die? And these sorts of questions. What is the mind? What's its relationship to the brain? If indeed they're not the same thing. Those questions actually are not so different from traditional koans, and they are certainly not different in attitude. If you really, really are perplexed by one of those questions, any of them, and you really want to know the answer, sitting down and staring into what the mind does with that question is a very interesting thing to do. Now, if you're a scientist, you'll be doing that anyway in a very intellectual kind of way. But I've been trained by then for, some decades in learning to sit down and allow the mind to calm down, allow openness, an open kind of inquiry where a question can arise and sort of hang around, not verbally. And I realized that I wanted to do that in a more disciplined way. And so this idea of 10 Zen questions came to me. Why don't I take 10 of my favorite difficult questions and devote myself to them in meditation and write about what I find? For my own benefit, really. And my agent said, I want to write it anyway. It's an excuse for me to do the work and to enjoy writing it. So I did that. So 10 Zen questions came out in 2000, I don't remember, 9? I don't know. Anyway, it was just a hardback. And then they said they wanted the paperback. And they said, but we don't like the title, and we think we should call it Zen and the Art of Consciousness. And I was like, well, you can't do that, because, what about motorcycle maintenance? And it's not, it's too big. Yeah, it's too big a deal to call it that. And, and I would be embarrassed for it to kind of take on the cachet of perhaps splendidly wonderful book, which of course I read because I'm old. I read it when it first came out. And it influenced me at the time. I mean, it was an extraordinary book in that time.
Yeah.
And so I felt very embarrassed about this. And I asked people, and people, some people said, "Oh, you can't have that," and other people said, "Yeah." Anyway, publishers do what they want, whatever. Anyway, and so it's come out under the new title of Zen and the Art of Consciousness. But I should say that actually, it's a very fair title in a way. I realized after I got over the embarrassment and kind of feeling really annoyed and silly about it, Zen and the Art of Consciousness. See, the science of consciousness and the philosophy of consciousness are what I have devoted most of my writing to. Neuroscience and philosophy are the two major contributors to most of the consciousness conferences that I used to go to and the textbook. What about the art of consciousness? In other words, the skill, the doing it, the art in the sense of, doing it for yourself and seeing it rather than either analyzing it philosophically or going out and doing experiments physically. There's an art to consciousness. And meditation and mindfulness and some of these other practices are the arts of consciousness, I would say. And so actually I think it's quite a good title in the end.
It is an excellent title, and I'm glad you talked about that, because that was the final question I wanted to wrap up with, and you've already answered it, is we as skeptics, I as a meditator and a skeptic often get the question, well, why do you meditate? What are you getting out of it? And exactly what you've addressed here is a greater awareness of what's going on in my mind and how that relates to my moment-by-moment experience. And that's what you've done here. And I'm glad you explained the titles and the art of consciousness, because your description of that versus our more clinical, analytical study of it is also part of our experience as people and in everyday life.
Yes, but it's very interesting there that you've embedded in what you just said a really difficult question, as though I'd answered it, but I don't believe I have, which is, why do I meditate? What do you get out of it, you said. What do you get out of it? From a Zen perspective, certainly, the idea that you get something out of it is the problem, not the solution. Now, my writing that book was certainly, in a way, what did I get out of it? And what I got out of it was I gave myself an excuse to put more effort into rather specific types of meditation. Some people would say abusive meditation, because I was doing a much more intellectual kind of meditation than I would normally do, although a lot of it was more like koan meditation, which becomes less intellectual as you go along. But the question of what to get out of meditation, I think for anyone who meditates, is a really tricky question. Part of the answer is that it shifts as you go through your life or through, your time of practice. And I'm sure that's been the case with you. People start for different reasons. So many people start for relaxation or something of that kind, and actually we know that meditation is no more relaxing than sitting down reading a book, so, why go through the hassle if you just want to relax?
Yeah, take a vacation, that's,
Yeah, exactly, yeah, or go for a walk. I think many people start through pain and anguish, and I don't know why I started. Well, I've already told you to some extent why I started. That experience that I had was so extraordinary, and it led me to the feeling that I didn't understand anything at all about the world I was in. If that could happen, then I don't know what the world is, what I am, or anything. And that curiosity was one of the reasons. I suspect also pain and anguish of the kind of, I don't like myself, I can't cope with myself. I think you can imagine that I'm the sort of person that's rather obvious all the time. I've never been able to kind of walk into a party and nobody noticed, you know what I mean? And that's kind of hard to cope with, And all my childhood I was in trouble, endless trouble. I was really naughty and all of these things. Who knows? But, the reasons I got into it are very different from the reasons that then would come along to keep meditating, which were, well, hang on, this seems to be doing me some kind of good. I feel a bit more at ease with myself, or I feel a bit more able to cope with things, or I'm beginning to get some insights, or I'm beginning to understand a bit better, and I think the meditation is helping. So the kind of instrumental sort of reasons for meditating. But then you begin to come against this whole kind of path, no path, many of the paradoxes within Zen of, if you try too hard, who is trying? I am trying. I'm the problem. Meditation is, to some extent, in many of the teachings, about dropping the self, dropping aims and objectives and trying. On the other hand, if you don't ever try in the first place, you never get anywhere. So you can't just not try. And how does one not try? I can remember many times in my life, often with interesting drugs, because this is a good thing to try if you have an interesting drug, to try to not try or try to not do anything. And I've often come up to a point. I can remember several of them, sort of flashbulb memories of this. Of coming to the point of I can't not do. I can't not do without disappearing, and disappearing is completely terrifying. I mean, there are many ways, as I'm sure you know, of coming to these points in meditation where a great letting go seems to be required, and it's very difficult, and that's just one of those, I think. Although I came to it first through other means, I came to it intellectually, I came to it through drugs long before I came to it through meditation. But there's all that whole paradox, several paradoxes running along there about doing and not doing. I can remember very early on, one of the earliest retreats I went to at John Crook's retreat house up in Wales with his teacher from Taiwan, who described meditation practice as like climbing a glass mountain, and you go struggling up, and then you come to nice plateaus where you stroll along, and then you come to really difficult bits and you struggle along, and whenever you have ladders that help you get up, you throw them away, you don't need them anymore, and blah, blah, blah. And when you get to the top, you realize that there wasn't any mountain in the first place. And that, to me, on that retreat, 30 years ago perhaps, or no, probably 25 years ago, was a horrific idea. Well, why should I struggle all this way? All I'm going to discover at the end is all worthless and pointless. Now, I think we live in a pointless universe. It's pointless. They're fine. Okay, I'm quite happy with it now.
I'm all right with that, yeah.
Yeah, I'm all right with that. But I wasn't then. I know I wasn't. I know it really, really was awful. And this is the kind of thing I'm talking about. The one changes through meditation practice about the things that seem so awful. Now it doesn't seem to me awful at all that you throw away the boat when you've crossed the river, or whatever it is, you struggle to build yourself a ladder to get somewhere, and then you throw it away and realize you've never climbed anywhere anyway. And the whole idea about the notion of self, which I've gone into intellectually, which I've written parts of books about, written articles about, struggled with in my daily life, and sat with in meditation endlessly. Who is this? I think the self is endlessly recreated ephemeral structures that just arise and think that they are the same one that was there a few minutes ago. Every time a self comes up, it sort of grabs onto all this past and goes, oh, that was me who did all those things that this me can now remember. Oh, that was me. And we build up, accrete this enormous construction. It's all illusory. The memories, and not every scrap is illusory. The illusion is that there is a continuing entity, when actually it's just this kind of recreated, a bit similar to the last one, but, most of the time there isn't one at all. We don't even notice that. We go on believing that the self is conscious all day and has a stream of consciousness and all of that. So, these are the ideas which I've expressed in some of my writings, but they're really coming right out of sitting in meditation and being able now, after nearly 30 years, well, more than 30 years of meditation, but 30 years of going on retreats and serious practice, of being able to sit with that and be perfectly okay with it. So, to your question, why meditate? I would say now, I just do it. I've done it I get up every morning and meditate, not for very long, 15, 20 minutes. I don't see myself stopping. I'm not doing it for some particular reason. I don't know is the answer, and that's very different. And maybe I'll come to another stage where I do it because. Who knows?
Well, it's an ongoing changing experience, and as you said, that the reasons one starts are not necessarily the reasons one continues or one finds in future sittings. It's going to find its way into whatever the circumstances of your life and your particular development at that time, wherever you are in your place. There can be different reasons to do this. Yes,
and practicing is one part of practicing is allowing that to be so.
Right, and that's been one of the challenges for many meditators, that they need to and I've done this myself, I get stuck into I have to do it this way, and these are the experiences I'm supposed to have.
Yeah.
And the advantage in an interview with Jason Siff was the idea that, you need to let things happen more organically. You need to investigate these changes and allow them to occur rather than nail them into a box of what's supposed to occur.
Well, I think one can do both. I'm thinking of the jhanas. Are they the Yeah, I went to a lecture, and I'm sorry I can't remember the teacher's name. Excellent American teacher who came over here recently and taught about jhanas. And I would really like to go on one of his retreats where you get actually taught those, and this is supposed to happen. If you do this, this is supposed to happen. Because I bet, I'm guessing, my hypothesis is that there are brain functions which have been tapped into over, all these millennia, and that really there are things that you do that will follow. I mean, we know that from all kinds of practices that people do. And I will be really interested to do that in that very deliberate, purposeful way, because I would be interested in it.
Interesting that you should bring that up, because I do interview neuroscientists on this podcast, and that's one of the things that I've been suggesting, because I hear this from listeners, is that we'd like to see studies of what's happening in the brain at, say, the various jhana states, and see what's going on in that compared to what's going on when you're doing metta meditation or vipassana, or the different kinds of meditation, to see what's happening in there. Of course, it's very difficult to create your benchmark and your control for that, because most of the studies that we see nowadays are based on MBSR, and they start with people who are, as they say, meditation naive, I think is the phrase that they use. And then they teach the meditation, they do it for a period of time, and then they measure the brain again to a control group who hasn't done any, and we see changes in that. But we're really interested in exactly what you're saying is, okay, so is are different parts of the brain lighting up? Are different parts of the brain thickening? Or, what are the effects, the biological effects, the neurological effects that we see in these different states? So, many of us are very interested in seeing that.
Right, and I think that's interesting work, and I really hope, and I'm glad there are lots of people doing that kind of work now, and I'm sure there will be more, because the taboo seems to have been lifted from that, and that will answer some very interesting questions. I wouldn't be surprised if in a few years' time we could say, the first jhana is this happening, and the second jhana is this happening, and so on. And I would love to be trained enough to be able to be part of that. But going back to where this came from in our conversation, that doesn't, you can do that while realizing that is not the purpose of why you're doing your meditation every day. There are many other things going on which would not be measurable in that way, which are slow lifetime changes, and really change the way that you as a person, as a physical body embedded in this world with friends and everything, react to the things that go on. The attitude you have towards self and its importance, and your attitude towards, for example, free will and control and what you're doing, what you're responsible for, all of those things are not going to have very obvious brain correlates. I mean, they're based in what happens in the brain, but you're not going to be able to say, some slow lifetime change in attitude can be seen in the amygdala or something of that kind. And so I'm saying one can meditate for many different reasons, and it can be a part of one's life for different reasons. So I will go on doing my daily meditation, which seems to be loosening up a whole lot of things and changing gradually, alongside having a great interest in doing some of these much more purposeful things with the meditation. It's not either or, I guess. That was a long answer to say it's not either or. We don't have to commit ourselves to one reason why we meditate. We can meditate for lots of reasons.
Well, we've been speaking with Professor Susan Blackmore. If you'd like to find out more about Susan and her work and her writings, her web address is www.susanblackmore, that's more.co.uk. Sue, thank you so much for being here. This has been wonderful.
And I've really enjoyed it. I don't always enjoy these conversations. You never know, some person who emails you out the blue. But I've really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at www.secularbuddhistassociation.com, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaiser Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.